My name's John Griffiths. I work for Fox IT, or Foxit, as we're more commonly known, or certainly by people in reception when I go to customers. I've got a gentleman from Foxit for you. It's a great start. A little bit about my background. Why am I here talking to you about problem management? It's not because I've had lots of problems in my life, but because I basically have a lot of involvement with customers who are wrestling with problem management. And for a day job with Fox IT, I do a combination of training and consultancy, so I do get to see both sides of it. I've been doing this for quite a while now. I joined Ultracom back in 1995. Nice to see the one or two people in the room back from those days. That became Fox in 2000, but I didn't fancy that proposition, so I went to Australia for 4 years. And I wish I had a fiver for every time someone said, "And why did you come back?" To spend days like this in the freezing cold. In 2007, I became the inaugural winner of the ITSM's Trainer of the Year. You don't have to applaud or anything like that, and as I warned my delegates, I probably peaked in 2007, and it's gone downhill since then, so don't raise your expectations just because of that. So, to the presentation. I gave this the snappy title of "Are you communicating problems or just having problems communicating?" I thought that was quite snappy when I dreamt it up a few months ago. Now I'm not so sure, but anyway, let's look at what I'm going to talk about during this presentation. First of all, looking at communication from a problem management perspective. I'm going to talk about the key links in the chain and what that chain, there's an echo there, what that chain actually is the chain from the customer into the service desk, to incident management, to problem management, and all the way back again. And what this presentation is primarily based around is the challenges of how we move up and down that communication scale. So looking at the issues and wrapping up hopefully with some pointers as to how you might address or manage some of those situations. So let's begin then with a reality check. A reality check on communication in terms of how we actually perceive it. What I'm doing right now is communicating, and you might think that it's just a straightforward one-to-one interaction. I speak, you listen, perfect. However, it isn't actually that straightforward, is it? If you think about things that are said, they're very often not what is actually heard, are they? People interpret things in different ways, and because we communicate every day naturally, there's an assumption that everybody's actually good at it. Is there anybody in the room that would confess to being a bad driver? No, of course not. But you've only got to look around, haven't you? Every day on the road, accidents happening, things occurring. So that disproves that theory. Not everybody is a great driver. And it's pretty much the same thing here with communication. Everybody naturally thinks they can communicate, when in actual fact, it's a bit more variable. So it isn't always like that. It's sometimes, well, it's not sometimes, it is always more like this. It's a very complex maze of things. For example, I spoke about bad drivers. Sometimes when you have serious accidents, they end up in court. It's always struck me as a bit odd. You know, when people are witnesses, they go up and they say, "I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." You know, the curious thing is, there is no such thing as the whole truth. It is only the truth as you perceive it to be. And what I mean by that is you might have three people, for example, all witness the same accident, but they would give three different interpretations of what they actually saw. I'm not suggesting that two of them are lying, it's simply how they perceive these things. And that is exactly what we're dealing with every day when we're trying to communicate anything, but particularly when we're trying to communicate problem information. It's essential that we actually get this as concise as possible, because as we're weaving our way through this maze of information here, it is very simple for us to end up miscommunicating things. So, This slide is horrible. It's full of horrible arrows and things like that, and the sole reason I put it up here, very briefly, is just to illustrate the myriad of interfaces that problem management practitioners, people working in that arena, potentially have to deal with. They could be dealing with people that are external to their organisation or internal, that are technical or non-technical, senior management, junior operators, because let's face it, problems have the potential to impact every single area of an organisation. So trying to work out the most appropriate communication mechanism for how we deal with problem management can be a real challenge. So let's just get rid of this slide and focus on really the heart of this, what I've called the communication spiral. Because it's here that you tend to see a more natural flow of information, communication going in and around the process of problem management. So I said this chain I was going to talk about covers from the customer, who is going to report what they will refer to as a problem, but we refer to as our incidents, into the service desk, which in turn is going to be captured by the incident management process, and if appropriate, it's going to go to problem management, and of course use change management as a controlled way of resolving those problems. So down this side of the spiral, we have all of the inputs, all of the communication coming down and driving those processes. And coming up the right-hand side, outputs, feedback, updates, etc., going back to the customer. When we look at it as a spiral on a diagram like this, all these lovely little interactions that are flowing down and flowing up the other side look almost perfect. But the issue really is that each one of these is an opportunity for miscommunication. One of the challenges we've got here is how do you do this? How do you translate what a customer's actually saying into the relevant criteria that each one of these phases has to deal with? So let me just expand on that principle a little bit further. This diagram here refers to, if any of you have been unfortunate enough to be on one of my training courses, you'll know I talk a lot about above and below the waterline. And here's our waterline, here's our service desk, and above the waterline we've got the relationship between the customer and IT. What we're actually trying to do, I sometimes refer to this as a swan diagram. The reason I call it that is because above the waterline, what we're actually trying to create here is this beautiful sunny day, remember those? When our swan's just gliding gracefully along on the water and everything's perfect and under control, and it's wonderful, isn't it? Below the waterline, that's the reality of IT. That's where we know the water's very murky, that we're sort of paddling around like mad, it's very chaotic and frenetic. And what we're trying to do is pull together these two very different environments and communicate effectively through them. So let's look at this communication issue then here. What we're basically trying to do is take customer information, drive it through here, and in this specific instance, drive it into problem management so that it can be managed effectively. However, if we think about that spiral I just described earlier, as these incidents and requests come into the service desk, they're delivered using business input and business language. I often talk about incidents as being the customer experience. So what they're going to describe to a service desk is what's happened to them. So they will phone up and say things like, I can't log on to this application, because that's what they've actually experienced. It's unlikely they're going to phone up and say, your server's offline, because they wouldn't or shouldn't actually know that fact. That's what's happening down here. So we're trying to tie these two things together, and our start point is using business language as the input, which the service desk are then expected to translate and interpret. And there is our first classic opportunity for miscommunication. Some customers are very good at explaining what their incident is. Some are actually too good at it. Our service desk is very often in a situation where it's under pressure to get these things processed quickly, and that ability to make that translation of what the customer is telling them against how they log it is really the first step to information that problem management is ultimately going to end up with. So when we get down into second, third line support areas and things like this, we tend to be dealing with technical issues and sometimes quite complex ones. Now, I acknowledge that not every problem is a result of a technical issue, okay, but it is almost certainly the case that people working in the problem management arena will have quite a technical bias. So when we look at that from sort of customer down to problem management and what is happening in the middle of it, we've actually created a buffer, okay, which can be positive or negative based on the interactions of our service desk and our support teams that interface to it. Because that is one of the key areas of disconnection which can have a very adverse impact on problem management if they're not working effectively together with each other. So when we look at this, it's almost, you could describe this as talking about this in 3 different languages. That could be Spanish, that could be Greek, and that could be Italian. I don't know about you, but I struggle with some conversations in just one language, so actually trying to run them in 3 could be a major issue. So this translation process, I would suggest, is one of the start points in terms of trying to understand the quality and the type of information that actually comes into the problem management arena. So, having described communication being perceived as a straight line, it tends to be what I would consider more of a sort of long and winding road. So while we think about straight line communication, I've said this, you've understood it, now go and do it. It tends to be more a sort of long and winding road. As I've already mentioned, the customer will have varying capabilities of describing what's actually happened to them, what's actually gone wrong. The service desk need the ability to interpret that information, and they're going to interpret it into some form of incident record that is going to put into an IT context what that customer has actually described to them. And again, when we push back down here, we're looking at problem management, which has a fairly technical bias in many cases. So as we go through all of these different interactions, there is the potential to actually dilute the original message. If you imagine this customer's got a torch and they're actually shining it into IT, the further into IT it goes, the dimmer that beam becomes. In other words, we're diluting all of this information to a point where it loses a level of recognition of what it actually started out as the intent from the customer. Now you notice there's a sort of big gap here on the left-hand side of this slide, and that's because there is an ingredient that's required here to really make that process as smooth as possible, and it's this. Good old service level management. Now, again referring to this above and below the waterline concept, service level agreements obviously agreed with IT to the business, underpinned with our operational agreements and underpinning contracts. Could I just ask, as a quick show of hands, how many people in the room feel they have a comprehensive set of agreements in place that would help manage this working relationship that happens operationally? A few, 10%, 15%? Okay, thank you. There's a subsequent question to that coming a bit later, but I can't emphasise enough how important service level management is in trying to facilitate more effective communication. What I'm going to do a little bit later in this presentation is look at these 4 specific perspectives. Okay? And it's service level management that actually helps create the framework that is going to facilitate better communication, not only for problem management, but all of the day-to-day operational things that go on. So if you are struggling with getting problem management working effectively. It may not be problem management itself that you need to be focusing on, but possibly understanding service level agreements, and not just actually putting them in place, but also making them culturally acceptable. A lot of organisations do put SLAs in place, but end up only paying lip service to them. It's essential that they are a key part of IT to make sure that this winding road doesn't end up going off course. Okay? You know, we often talk in IT about efficiency and effectiveness. It would be better if that was a straight line communication rather than meandering its way into problem management. But the reality of life is that's very often how that happens. So basically, when we think about communication as being that lovely, nice spiral, the reality of life is it looks a little bit more like this. If you can't work out what that is, it's a can of worms. And when I was putting this presentation together, I actually had an image of some real worms in a can. And it was so disgusting, I had to take it out and replace it with some edible worms. Anyway, let's move on from that. Let me give you an illustration of how communication gets diluted. This is clearly an old example because this is a memo rather than an email, but that doesn't matter. I'm just going to walk you through this illustration, okay? And it's how information is cascaded through an organisation. So the CEO decides to send a memo to his head manager or the key director. I'm just going to literally quote this from the slide. Okay? So the message reads, today at 11 o'clock there will be a total eclipse of the sun. This is when the sun disappears behind the moon for 2 minutes. As this is something that cannot be seen every day, time will be allowed for employees to view the eclipse in the car park. Staff should meet in the car park at 10 to 11 when I will deliver a short speech introducing the eclipse and giving some background information. Safety goggles will be made available at a small cost. That's the original message. That goes to the head manager, who in turn passes on to the department managers as so. Today at 10 to 11, all staff should meet in the car park. This will be followed by a total eclipse of the sun, which will appear for 2 minutes. For a moderate cost, this will be made safe with goggles. The CEO will deliver a short speech beforehand to give us all some information. This is not something that can be seen every day. That message is passed on to the floor managers, who now say that the CEO will today deliver a short speech to make the sun disappear for 2 minutes in the form of an eclipse. This is something that cannot be seen every day, so staff will meet in the car park at or 11, and this will be safe if you pay a moderate cost. That is then passed on to the supervisor, who then issues the memo saying that 10 or 11 staff are to go to the car park where the CEO will eclipse the sun for 2 minutes. This doesn't happen every day, it will be safe, and as usual, it will cost you. Finally, the supervisor sends the message to the staff that says some staff will go to the car park today to see the CEO disappear. It's a pity this doesn't happen every day. Now, the one thing you notice about that trail of communication is that it got shorter and shorter. It also tended to mix up some of the key messages and sort of blur them into things that had a slightly different intent. One of the reasons we get less and less information as we go down the chain is because there's a sort of inbuilt view that, you know, whoever's communicating that to, should we say, junior staff, they don't need to know as much as they already know. I mean, this freezing cold day today reminds me of many moons ago. I used to be in the army, and I remember standing freezing to bits on parade squares in weather like this. And I always used to think to myself, why are we standing here freezing? And the answer was a communication similar to that. So the commanding officer would say, oh, I'd like to inspect the men at 11 o'clock, you know, on parade. And as it goes down the chain, you know, everybody adds 5 minutes onto it just to make sure everybody's on time. So we're out there at 10:15 waiting for an 11 o'clock inspection. You know, a similar thing's happening here. Now remember, in that communication spiral, problem management is very often at the end of that chain of activity. So one of the challenges we've got here is the information that we end up with is not that reflective of the original intent that was set out. So, having looked at that, let me just go back to these perspectives of those 4 links in the chain: customer, service desk, incident, and problem. These are some of the considerations that customers will have in relation to how they're trying to communicate to IT. Their number one priority is that they want their problem resolved. That's a reasonable expectation, but we need to be considering this in the context of everybody's problems being solved. And that's one of the reasons why we need this service level management framework to help us out with this. Because they will often consider that they're the only customer who needs some form of service. There is a great quote in the service operation book that says, "Good services require good customers." And it's absolutely true. You know, we do need customers to do their bit in terms of contributing to this effective communication of what their issues actually are. They won't distinguish the difference between incident and problem management. And you might well be sitting there thinking, and why should they? To which there is some validity. However, one of the things that IT is generally not very good at is marketing itself. And actually for a customer to understand the paradox of the difference between incidents and problems is actually quite an important concept, as we'll see a little bit later. We need to think about the cultural perspective as well. They may not even be aware of, or worse still, not care about targets. You know, one of the real challenges we have with processes is that they're great all the time, everything's working okay. But when the pressure's on, when people are shouting about why haven't we restored this service yet, that's very often the time the processes go out the window. Okay. So we need basically to have a framework of agreements which are actually culturally implemented. And what I mean by that is the point I made earlier regarding, you know, is it just a tick in the box that you've got SLAs for all your services, or are they actually actively worked in terms of escalations of calls and handling, all those sorts of things, so that we can keep this under control and focus on the key things. Something that increasingly happens from the customer perspective is they get a bit fed up with IT and go and try and fix it themselves. You've probably heard about the always-on generation, that more and more people coming into the workplace using social media and things like that. We're not here to debate that today, but it clearly is a debate as to whether that's a good or bad thing. But it is something that is happening. Even worse than trying to fix it themselves, they might even try to tell you how to fix it. You know, these customers out there that have just over the weekend, you know, connected their kids' laptops to or their PlayStation to their PC at home, and suddenly they think they can run the entire corporate network for you. Potentially dangerous arena, but something again that has to be managed, because it is going to distort the whole communication flow if we don't consider how we manage those things. It's quite common, you know, when I'm saying that they may want to tell you how to fix it. One of the things the internet has taught customers to do is be impatient. Okay? If it's a simple issue that they're trying to resolve, and IT come back and go, yeah, we'll get back to that in 3 days' time, I go, hang on, 3 minutes on Google and I can sort that out. So again, it's another thing that we have to manage, because the potential is that we're sending things off in different sort of tangents and not keeping control of this whole flow of communication that we need. The other key thing that's actually not on here is the very ability of that customer to describe what's happening to them. You know, and any of you that have ever worked on a service desk will know the customer who phones up and sort of just basically grunts at you and says, "My PC's broke," and that's about all they can tell you. You know, and that's where the real challenge of good service desk operators come into play, with regards to being able to extract the key information that we're going to need to be able to process this. From a service desk perspective, the customer is actually interfacing to, remember, they're going to be dealing with multiple customers It's an unfortunate fact of life also that most service desks these days are under-resourced and very often under pressure to meet increasing deadlines, to turn over a number of calls. So that in itself is going to make it a difficult conversation with the customer, because they'll be being pressurised by different drivers and targets, for example. Information captured here, remember, is what is going to be worked on by problem management ultimately. And the one way you can guarantee to really annoy your customer is to allow your problem management people to phone them up and say, can you explain this all to me again? Because the obvious response is, I just explained all that to the service desk. They may have done, but if that information is not captured effectively, then problem management has no option to go back and deal with the customer. And that's where we start to create some of the ripples on that nice smooth pond that I was talking about earlier. So the service desk has this challenge to translate customer descriptions into IT requirements, and that's where we introduce the potential for a lot of this communication to be lost in translation. What we're doing at the service desk is using incident management to deal with this. However, we introduce a few complexities here as well. For example, we all know incident management is all about restoring normal service as quickly as possible. That's a very noble objective, but sometimes that isn't entirely conducive to helping problem management. One of the reasons for that is because if you're very focused on solving incidents, you very often end up solving the same incident over and over again and masking what problem management's trying to do, some root cause analysis. It very often takes longer to do detailed root cause analysis and find permanent solutions, so we do find ourselves fixing repetitive incidents in many situations, which doesn't help the problem management process fully exploit its potential to find these permanent solutions. Something that was mentioned in incident management is this concept of OMTC, ownership, monitoring, tracking and communication. That is a responsibility of incident management, and it's one of the ways we actually tie incident and problem management together. Unfortunately, in real life, it rarely happens to its fullest extent. One of the common things you see happen is a service desk passing a call to a support team and then just completely disowning any accountability or responsibility for it. And that is how you break the chain from a communication perspective. And it is probably the #1 issue that prevents problem management working effectively. Because if you do break that link at that point, you start to introduce all manners of complexities about things like escalation and communication to the appropriate people. And related to that, the third point here I've put is the desire or reluctance to actually involve problem management. I sometimes see situations where the working relationship between these two areas can be influenced in some cases by bad management. Well, not necessarily bad management, but bad management decisions. For example, the incident manager may want to, or has been challenged with, increasing the first-time fix rate. Again, noble objective, but sometimes working to the detriment of problem management. So things that should be going to problem management for proper assessment and analysis are actually just being patched up as incidents to improve our first-time fix rate. We're not talking about CSI today here, but that is a sort of example of how bad measurements lead to bad behaviours. And using things like balanced scorecard, etc., would help manage those types of scenarios. But it is something that happens quite commonly in those situations. Finally, the problem management itself, well, as I've already said, it normally is one step removed from direct contact to the customer, and trying to have a conversation in a sort of three-way arrangement rather than a two-way one is always more challenging. If you're having a one-to-one conversation, hopefully there should be a level of clarity and understanding. Introducing, a third part of that conversation is going to naturally introduce more interpretation and more opportunities to misunderstand what the original requirement was from the customer. The quality of the information, again, is a major disadvantage to problem management, but unfortunately it's something they have no say in until it actually lands in their queue. So there are things going on that are almost outside of problem management's direct control, but it still has to deal with it. And another thing, one of the focal points of problems is, of course, the root cause analysis, which is very important, but it isn't necessarily that important to the customer, because they're not particularly interested in what you're going to do in the future. They just want their service restored. So even at this point, where problem management might be working on a very structured approach to fixing a problem, that's their emphasis. But the customer's emphasis is get my service working again. They sound the same, but they're not necessarily. I think the one time I actually earn my money is when we do assessments for organisations and we get to the problem management bit and you're presenting it all and you say to them, problem management scored 7 out of 100. And they go, what are you talking about? That's rubbish, you know, we fix problems every day. To which the normal response is, yes, you do. You do fix them every day, but you don't go on and find permanent solutions to prevent them reoccurring. That is the real key of good problem management. So another reason why miscommunication happens in all of this is the very fact that there is a misunderstanding about what the actual perspectives of each sequence of people involved in this communication process are dealing with. And that's why I've sort of tried to emphasise the point of this end-to-end, because problem management cannot be an effective communicator on its own. It is dependent on the service desk and other areas to help it. Just want to look at a few brief points about problem communication specifically, because there's things we need to consider here. Working in problem management is not easy. One of the sort of key skills you need is the ability to investigate, try and understand the cause of problems occurring in the first place. That may involve interviewing people to obtain facts and information, but what happens if you're interviewing the person who caused the problem? You know, how likely are they to sit there and volunteer the information and go, yeah, fair cop gov, I did do that unauthorised change, it was me. You know, it's almost like, you know, police detective work, isn't it? You know, they round up all the suspects and then they eliminate them one by one through interviews and things like that. And again, that is a core skill, the ability to interview, to analyse and extract key information. But how many problem managers are actively trained in interviewing techniques or questioning techniques? I'm sure our friends at Kepner Tregoe can probably help you out in that area, but you know, it is a key point. Because if we can't do that, we're going to struggle to find the right details and information we need to continue this effective communication. Most problem management information is negative. Okay? By that I mean when people are asking for updates and you're saying things like, no, we haven't fixed it yet. No, we don't know what the root cause is. No, we haven't got enough people with the right skills to sort this out. Again, that's challenging. And again, people are really trained in how to communicate bad news versus good news. Because the only bit of good news that comes from problem management is we fixed it. And that's only good news if you fixed it within the agreed timescales. So we are going to have to deal with a lot of negative things, and this in itself creates more pressure for problem management people because they will be getting leaned on by management. Which is this point down here about beware of the Nike management style. The Nike management style is a term that I coined, but you may know it better as JDI or JFDI. And it's basically, you know, just do it, just get it done. And we've all been there, haven't we? And while it might be great for that sort of macho management style to just do it, okay, it is not conducive to good communication and it's not conducive to good process management. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, that when the pressure's on, that is the time when the processes go out the window. You know, we often talk a lot in service management about senior management support. My interpretation of senior management support, and the true test of it, is when senior managers stand by the process and don't just run roughshod over it. Okay? In other words, they don't adopt the Nike management style. They continue to work with the processes because that's what they're there for in order to manage that. So do be very wary of that. You know, if that happens in your organisation, you are going to continue to struggle to effectively communicate problem issues. So just a few pointers just to round up what I've been describing here. Some things you might want to consider with regards to improving the way problem management can get the relevant visibility of what it's trying to communicate. The service desk is key to helping problem management, if for no other reason in terms of how it actually ties things together, how it captures that information in the first place, and how it's presented to problem management. There's very often sort of them and us, you know, we're technical, they're admin people, that type of mentality going on in a lot of support areas. And we really need to try and break those barriers down to facilitate better input of information to problem management staff. Understanding the different types of communication needed as it moves between the different areas and processes. So that thing I was describing about the business, the interpretation of that, the technical feedback, we need to be thinking about how we align those things to make it as easy as possible to make those translations so we don't lose key information as part of that translation process. And another thing I see a lot of, I put here focus on facts, not subjective views or planned intentions. Problem management staff themselves have a responsibility to document what they're actually doing. And when you see statements like, I'm waiting for evidence from the customer, or I'll go and visit them tomorrow, that isn't overly helpful. You know, statements of intent are actually pointless unless they're followed up with statements like, I did visit the customer, I did do this. But what we're actually looking for is a stepped, planned sequence of events that actually describes what they're actually doing to resolve problems. Because that's how we're going to build our knowledge base, how we're going to build our solutions database, all those sorts of things. So dealing with facts rather than superfluous issues is key to getting good quality information to build our understanding of the infrastructure. Helping the customer understand the difference between incident and problem management, that's probably never going to be high on anyone's agenda or priority list, but it is something that is part of an overall communication plan. And this again is something that service level management can help with regards to how we actually do that. Do look at the end-to-end communication, so don't think about just communicating between problem management or support staff, but do think of it in a broader context as to how you can get better quality information from the outset. Because that in turn will enable you to feed back good information. Conflicting perspectives at each layer is basically seeing things from the other person's point of view, from where you're interacting with, whether that's the customer to the service desk or support teams into the service desk. Understand those perspectives so that we can follow this whole flow of information. And integrate effective communication techniques into training. You know, if you do have people that are skilled in extracting core information, again, it's going to help with the diagnosis, analysis, and all those factors around the problems. And look to align the perspectives and expectations with reality is basically saying, if you've got SLAs, then actively promote them to get people to adhere to them. Similar, the Nike management syndrome. Okay? We need to, I know it's very difficult to try and remove that if it's in place, but the more you can reinforce your processes, the less need there should be for that Nike management style. So there we are. I think that is about it. That is my time up. So thanks for listening, because that's good communication.